Do it perfectly the first time, you don't have to do it over, you know.
So we do it for.
That's right. All right, this thing is rolling, so let's get rolling. Phylum Chordata. We've worked our way through most of it already, but reminder, usually we think of Phylum Chordata as the vertebrates. But remember, there are two groups of chordates that don't have a backbone. And those are the little things called the lancets and the tunicates. And once this decides to cooperate, there's a lancet. It's lancelet, I think. It looks a little bit like a fish. We'll talk more about why it's a chordate in a minute. And in this thing, the tunicate looks like a sponge, but it's actually pretty closely related to the other vertebrates because as a larva, it looks a lot like that. These are the things that make a chordate be a chordate. They have this rod in their back, dorsal support rod. In most chordates, that dorsal support rod goes away before they're actually born, and it becomes the disc in between your backbones, your vertebrae. In the lancelet, they keep that their whole life though. They have pharyngeal gill slits along the throat. Scientists think that the genes for some of those mutated, and that's how we developed jaws over time. Postanal tail, bilateral symmetry, two sides that are mirror images of each other. And the chordates are the deuterostomes. Chordates and echinoderms are deuterostomes, and that means that the blastopore, that first opening into our ball of cells, becomes the anus. And we also have what's called indeterminate cleavage, which means our cells divide several times before they are methylated. So they remain stem cells for a pretty long time during embryonic development. We talked a little bit about the different groups of chordates. We looked at this phylogenetic tree. And remember, what's implied to be down there at the bottom of the tree? Common ancestor of everything else above it. Common ancestor of all vertebrates. And remember that these things in these white boxes, like here and here and here, those are called derived traits, or derived characteristics. And they're traits, mutations, that happen and cause one group of animals, at least some of their ancestors, to become the next group up. Remember that as we go from bottom left up to top right, what's happening?
Wait, what?
As we go from bottom left up toward top right, what's happening? We're moving up in time, right? So these are most primitive, and these are most, what's the word I'm looking for here? Most advanced, we might think, in terms of evolution. The newest ones to evolve. So the first actual group of vertebrates, chordates with the backbone, are fish, and they're agnatha. And what have we said agnatha means? No jaws. Jaws fish. And we talked about a couple of examples of these: the hagfish and the lamprey down here. The lampreys are mostly parasites. They have these not jaws, but these sucker-like heads where they'll attach up to something, usually another fish, and they'll suck out its guts. It's almost like a vampire fish. But you do notice the gill slits along the way. Today, though, we'll mention the next group of fish, which are gnathostomes, which means they have a mouth with jaws. And remember, I said earlier that scientists think that the group of genes called the Hox genes, HOX, which are the genes that control where our major body parts are and how they're made, they think there was a mutation in this set of genes for gill slits, and that caused some of those gill slits to form the formation of jaws. The first animals with jaws, at least the first chordates with jaws, were class Chondrichthyes, and these are the cartilage fish, like sharks and rays. Remember, the only teeth they have are the only bones they have are their teeth. Their skeleton's mostly made out of cartilage, makes it light, helps them move fast. It's not quite as strong as bone. Their skin is really thick to keep it from drying out because most of them live in the oceans. Really good sense of smell, pretty good sight. This line down their sides for hearing called the lateral line and for picking up vibrations. And they have a cloaca, which is like the holding tube for waste from the digestive system, the urinary system, and also the reproductive system. All comes out the same place. There's a bull shark. The next group of fish we want to mention, or the next group of organisms, are the bony fish, and they're in a group called osteichthyes. And their big advancement, some of them have lungs, called lungfish. Because if we go back to this original phylogenetic tree, back up here for a second, all these derived characteristics that we're talking about things that help them be better at doing what? Yeah, but all these things here help the vertebrates become better at what? Living where? On land. Because we're moving from water to things that live on land, right? So they're all things that made them better at living on land. So the chondrichthyes were the first things with jaws. The bony fish, a couple of them, have lungs. Now, remember, most fish don't have lungs. Most bony fish don't have lungs. But a handful of them do. And it's like I said, class osteichthyes, bony fish, the most abundant vertebrates on Earth. They have a skeleton very much like yours, internal, made of calcium carbonate. They have this little flap over their gills called the operculum, which helps to move the water over the gills so that the fish aren't always having to what? Swim. It saves energy. They have a swim bladder, which helps them to float. And a lot of scientists think that the genes that coded for this swim bladder mutated to become what? Lungs. Fish have external fertilization. They lay the eggs outside the body and they get fertilized. They're oviparous, which means they lay eggs. They're ectothermic, which means what? Body temperature is controlled by the outside temperature. That's not as bad if you're in water, though, because what have we said about water? It has a high specific heat, which means its temperature doesn't change as much as the temperature of air. There are a couple of fish, specifically sharks, that are ovoviviparous, which means they have eggs, but they keep them where? In the body, hatch the eggs, out come the parts of the eggs, out come the baby. So that's a good way to protect the babies. Fish have 2 chambers in their heart. Unlike you have how many? 4. Here you can see this is the swim bladder, in about the same place where an organism's lungs might end up. The operculum would be over the top of these gills here, and it would flap around like that. Whoops. This thing is a lobe-finned fish. It's called a coelacanth. And a lot of people think that these things were close ancestors of what the next group of vertebrates. What came after fish? Amphibians. And they think that these fins, the genes that coded for these fins, they thought they were, but they're not. Mutated a little bit and became the limbs, the legs. So amphibians, their big derived trait, one of their big derived traits at least, is the development of limbs, arms and legs. That's not the right slide. So amphibians, frogs, salamanders, newts, toads, are ectothermic. Does that work all that great on land? Not so much. You're only going to find amphibians when what's going on? When are you going to find them out and about and active? Well, not necessarily when it's raining, but when the temperature is sort of moderate, right? They can't be out when it's too hot. They can't be out when it's too cold. Moderate temperatures. Otherwise, they're buried up in the ground somewhere or in the water. They do have limbs. They have lungs, but they're poorly developed, which means they have to supplement their lung breathing with what? How else do they have to breathe through their skin? Which means their skin has to be what? Moist and thin.
Country, Dakota freezes rain right now.
And again, is that a good strategy if you're living on land, to have thin, moist skin?
Probably not.
not so much, because that'll help you dehydrate, and also your skin can dry out. And if your skin dries out, you can't breathe, so you die. So you have to stay close to water. Not a good strategy. They have a 3-chambered heart, which is not a good strategy either. We'll talk about why in a second. They have to reproduce in the water, because their eggs look like what? Kind of jelly-like. And they have external fertilization, which again is not a good strategy, because what can happen? If it's all happening outside the body, sperm can dry out, eggs can dry out, babies can die. Not a good strategy. They're oviparous. They have to lay their eggs. So there's some amphibians, salamanders, frogs. You got a legless amphibian over there. Looks kind of like a snake, called a Sicilian. Here's a heart structure. 2 chambers in fish. 3 chambers in amphibians, and also in most reptiles. And the colors are important. Notice that when the blood comes back out of the gills, it's nice and red. And what does nice and red mean? Lots of oxygen. Comes back to the atrium, the top chamber of the heart. At the same time, blood coming back from the body comes over to the right side of the heart. Those both go into the bottom chamber. Bottom chamber is the ventricle. And when they go in, what happens to the blood? It gets mixed, which means it doesn't have nearly as much oxygen as it would in you. And that goes out to the body. So the amount of oxygen in their cells is limited, which means what's limited about frogs and the toads and so on.
Cell respiration.
How much cell respiration they can do, which limits what? How active they can be, how big they can be, all that kind of stuff. So you don't see huge amphibians. Still not huge. I mean, it's
That thing is huge.
this big, but it's not human size or anaconda size or something like that. It can't be all that big. Us and birds. Mammals and birds, on the other hand, have 4 chambers. And essentially, a 4-chambered heart gives you like 2 pumps in one heart. The left side pumps around what? Oxygenated. Right side pumps around deoxygenated. They don't mix, which means your tissues get lots of oxygen. You can get really big. You can be really active. And again, that works for birds. It also works for mammals. 4-chambered hearts. All right, move on to reptiles. Reptiles' big advancement is the amnion. What's an amnion? We talked a little bit about that last time.
Oh, it's the thing that like protects the heart children. Yeah,
It's not necessarily that, because you develop in an amnion too. It's a membrane that holds in what? The baby and the water, the amniotic fluid. So it lets you as a land-based animal develop still where? In the water. And that's important. So those are reptiles. Reptiles, though, are ectothermic. Still kind of holds them back. Are you going to find snakes in Antarctica? They'd be dead if you found them in Antarctica, right? If you find them in a desert, you're probably only going to find them when? At night, when it's kind of cool and moderate. So that holds them back. But again, what's the advantage of being ectothermic?
don't have to worry.
Don't have to eat as much, because you're not generating body heat for the sake of generating body heat. They have internal fertilization. They reproduce the same way we do, same basic parts. And that keeps sperm and eggs from drying out. They have the amniotic egg, which is the hard-shelled egg with an amnion. Let's look at a picture of that first. So that amniotic egg has a little sac right in here that holds in the baby and the water. That's the amnion. It has another sac called the yolk sac, which is basically holding in what?
The yolk.
Which is food. You have another sac over here called the allantois or allantois, depending on who you say it. What's that hold? Base, like uric acid and such. And then there's another membrane that encloses the whole thing and helps to exchange gases, and that's the chorion. But that's the amniotic egg. And again, it's hard-shelled, so it keeps water in and lets them lay those on land. They're not tied to the water. Reptiles have a 3-chambered heart, like amphibians, but the wall down in the bottom chamber, the ventricle, there's a beginnings of a wall. It almost divides it into 4. So what doesn't happen as much in in reptiles as it does in amphibians? Blood doesn't mix as much, so reptiles get more away. More oxygen to their tissue, so they can be bigger, they can be more active. Their fin is really thick and really water resistant because what works well in them that doesn't work so well in amphibians? Their lungs. They have a really good respiratory system. Most of them lay eggs. Most of them are oviparous. There are a few snakes. There's one around here that I know of, the garter snake, that's ovoviviparous. Keeps the eggs in the body, hatches them, out comes the babies, out comes the pieces of the eggs. So those are reptiles. Remember, reptiles are everything from turtles to lizards to snakes to alligators, crocodiles, and so on. All right, the 2 groups I want to focus on today, though, are the 2 we haven't talked too much about, birds and mammals. So birds are in a class called aves, and they are endothermic. Their body temperature is controlled by them. What we say is the downside of being endothermic. Have to eat a lot of food because you're making heat to regulate your body's temperature. The upside is you can live where? You can live pretty much anywhere and be active pretty much when? All the time. They have a 4-chambered heart like us, which keeps oxygenated and deoxygenated blood separate. Really light bones with air sacs that make them lighter so they can fly. Obviously, they have wings. Their lungs actually work a little bit better than those of mammals. Like the reptiles, they have amniotic eggs, which help them to develop on land. Birds are oviparous. They lay eggs outside the body. A lot of the organs that you have 2 of, they only have 1 of. So what are they trying to do by doing that? Cut weight so they can fly. But other than that, most of the organs they have are the same ones we have. There's a couple of exceptions. But most of the parts are very similar to what we have. All right, our focus for the rest of the time is on our class, which is Mammalia.
This is actually pretty hard.
George?
Say goodbye.
It's true. Some of us are mammals. Maybe most. But most of the rest of us will.
He said this about class members, I said let's take it.
I was thinking maybe mollusca for you.
You probably can actually find out. I don't know what that is. So.
You might have to
Joke's on you.
might have to Google it. Anyway, class Mammalia. What does the word mammal actually mean? It means breast. Yep. So mammals are mammals because of breastfeeding. Kind of an important thing. Don't necessarily have to have hair. Most of them do, but the word comes from breast and breastfeeding. Mammals, obviously, we have internal fertilization to make reproducing on land possible. Feed young with milk. That's a pretty good adaptation. Endothermic. 4-chambered heart like the birds. A really good respiratory system. Give birth to live young. And usually, the word for that is viviparous. We talked in class today that anytime we see viv or v, it means live. So give birth to live young. Now there's 3 subclasses of mammals. Normally it goes domain and then what? Domain, what's next? Kingdom. So we're in domain Eukarya, kingdom Animalia, then what comes next? Phylum, our phylum's Chordata, and our class is Mammalia. And usually what comes after class? Class, order, family, genus, species, right? There's some what we call subclasses of mammals. And they are placentals, marsupials, and monotremes. Placentals are things like most mammals. Mammals that have a placenta that attaches the mother to the developing baby and nourishes that baby, takes really good care of it. And when the babies come out, they're usually what? how the placental babies come out. Pretty well developed. The baby horse can get up and run in just a few minutes, right? On the other hand, marsupial babies, they're viviparous, but when the marsupial babies come out, what are they like? They are very, very underdeveloped, and they're going to move to where real fast. They're going to get in the pouch, where they will breastfeed and grow and live for sometimes another year, depending on the species. So they're not well developed. Those are marsupials. Marsupials are like things that live in Australia, most mammals in Australia. And what one mammal in North America? It's the only marsupial in North America. The possum. Yep, possum is a marsupial. Now there is a group of mammals, and as far as I know, there's only 2 examples of things in this group, the monotremes, that lay eggs. They're egg-laying mammals. Not leg-laying, egg-laying. What are the 2 examples of monotremes? The platypus, which is a cool, weird animal. And, anybody know the other one?
In other words, no, we don't.
A little thing called the echidna.
Oh, yeah.
It's a little anteater, spiny anteater. Both of which live where? Australia.
No.
So there's our platypus. Here's a possum, koala. Those are all marsupials. No, those are not all marsupials. This is a monotreme. These 2 are marsupials. Almost looks like yeah, almost looks like that. Here's some placentals, and again, most mammals are placentals. Everything from deer to a lion to a monkey to all the marine mammals to you, we're all placentals. So, in terms of our phylogenetic tree, our big derived traits, hair, mammary glands, we might also add to that well-developed what? Yeah, what do mammals have that's more well-developed than all the rest of those things? Brains. Well-developed brain. Yeah, it doesn't apply to everybody, but yeah, I don't know why I have all these extra slides in here. So again, our mammalian groups, we've got monotremes, which are the egg layers. Again, they're oviparous. It's the platypus and the echidna. You might not know this, but at least the platypus, maybe the echidna, I'm not sure. The platypus has this little poison gland. Where's it at? Yeah, it's on like one of its back legs, and it can kill things with the poison. It's not enough to kill a person. I think it just makes you swell up, get sore, but it's poisonous. It doesn't bite you; it like claws you, claws the poison into you. The marsupials, remember, are the pouched animals. ECHIDNA. And they have really short gestation periods. What's a gestation period? Yeah, the length of pregnancy. So their pregnancies are really short, and that's why the babies are born really underdeveloped, and they have to go spend some time in the pouch, the marsupial, to finish developing. We, on the other hand, and most other mammals, are placentals. Sometimes they're called eutherians, and we tend to have pretty long gestation periods. Offspring tend to come out pretty well developed. Now, why do our babies not come out well developed? Because we're placentals. Our babies are not all that well developed when they come out. I mean, a baby horse can hop up and run. Our babies, it takes a year for them to be able to even walk. Ours have a lot to do with the brain development. Our brains can do so much. It takes a while for all that to work, to be learned, and that kind of thing. So it's mostly about brain development in us. That's why our babies are not so well developed.
Is their brain like bigger than ours, or they just know more?
Neither one. Our brains have to know more. It just takes a while for it to.
Like horse versus.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, their brain's not nearly as complicated as ours. It takes ours a little while longer to get to where it needs to be. Oops. That's that. So, again, looking at this phylogenetic tree, this one's kind of blank. What's the big advancement, the derived trait that ought to be right here that allow things like the ancestors of lancelets and tunicates to become fish? We could say maybe gills, although no, I think lancelets actually have gills. And one thing you might not know, anything we write on this line, everything past it has to have it too. So if something has a derived trait here, everything on up is going to have it too.
Is that why there's like a little break between reptiles and birds, or like wings or whatever?
Yes, right. The thing we're going to put right here are vertebrae, a backbone. Because the fish are the first vertebrates. Between the jaws fish and the cartilaginous fish, what would we put right there? What trait? Jaws. And that's huge because that lets you eat all kinds of things you couldn't eat before, right? The leech is a worm. No, so it doesn't. None of this matters for the leeches. Different group. All right. What about between cartilaginous fish and bony fish? Yep, we said lungs. We said there's a few fish that develop lungs. Really primitive lungs, but lungs. Anyway. And then between where am I here? Between the bony fish and the amphibians, what do the amphibians have that the bony fish don't? Limbs, arms, legs. And then between the amphibians and the reptiles, what's the big evolutionary advancement that reptiles have that amphibians don't have? The amnion, that sac. But even though they're land animals, they're still developing in their own little personal pond of water, right? So it's protected. And then up here, between these guys, we still have an amnion. We could talk about somewhere in here where birds have wings and reptiles don't. But right in here, what do mammals have that none of the rest of those things have? Mammary glands. And the ability to breastfeed. We might also add hair. But those are our vertebrates. And we will stop on the vertebrates there for a minute. We're not going to stop yet today, though. Your Edmodo assignment this week is about ecology. So I'll give you guys who are here a little head start on that. Give me just a minute to get it pulled up. I didn't think we would get this far. Ecology is the study of what? Organisms and how they interact with each other and what? The environment. That's ecology. How organisms interact with each other and their environment. So if we were talking about in ecology, if we use the word biotic factors. Biotic means living, right? So biotic factors are living things that affect other living things. What would be an example of an abiotic factor that might affect you? A rock would be one, but something that might really affect your life.
Or you could eat it.
Like the air, how much oxygen's in the air, water availability, nitrogen availability, nutrient availability in general. So biotic factors are living things that might affect other living things. And abiotic factors are typically natural resources that affect organisms. We know what carrying capacity is, I hope. What's the symbol for carrying capacity? Big K, capital K. And we know that's the total number of organisms that an environment can sustain and support, right? let's talk for a minute about these pyramids. This is essentially like a food chain, right? The bottom level, what's the bottom level pretty much always called in a food chain? Primary producers. And there tend to be autotrophs. They can do photosynthesis usually. These are the producers. And then what's this next level usually called? Primary consumers. Secondary consumers. What's next? Tertiary, if there happen to be another one up there. Quaternary. And we know that they're drawn as pyramids because what gets smaller as you work your way from bottom to top? Availability of energy. How much does the amount of energy available to this level go down as you move up to that level? How much does it go down? 90%. Right? Only 10% of the energy in this level actually is transmitted up to that next level. Same from this level to this level, 10%. So the amount of energy available goes down real fast as you move up the food chain. And therefore, what else goes down real fast? The amount of organisms, right? The number of organisms, the mass of the organisms. And that's why when you get up here to the top, there are very few of these things at the top, right? Not very many, because there's not much energy available for them to use. We might call this an ecological pyramid. It might be called a trophic pyramid. What do we say troph means? Feeding or eating. It might also be just called an energy pyramid. Any of those work. And we can see it. While we're here, let's also talk about these cycles. The cycles that we're about to mention, we're going to call the biogeochemical cycles. So it's essentially how do living things cycle chemicals from the earth. We've said this before. How does the amount of carbon on Earth today depend on how much there was at day one of Earth? Yeah, but the amount of carbon on Earth today is essentially the same as it was day one of Earth, right? And this has just been recycled over and over again by living things. This is the carbon cycle. And the carbon cycle has two major parts, two major processes that cycle carbon. And what are those two processes? Processes that we've talked about over and over and over and over and over. How about photosynthesis and cellular respiration? So, in terms of carbon, what is photosynthesis doing with carbon? It's taking it from where? From the air and using it to make what? Organic molecules, like sugars, right? It's taking it out of the air and using it to make organic stuff, like sugars. Cell respiration, on the other hand, takes it from where? From the sugar, from the organic compound, and essentially does what to that organic compound? We said, what's a word? One word. Combustion, right? It's combustion. And in combustion, the purpose of combustion most of the time is to get out the energy, right? To get out the energy, use it to make ATP. And then what two things are always given off during combustion? Waste products. Water and carbon dioxide. So photosynthesis takes carbon dioxide out of the air and uses it to make sugar. Cell respiration takes that sugar and burns it and releases carbon dioxide. And those two processes just cycle carbon back and forth over and over again. Now, we as humans have affected the cycle quite a bit because what are we always doing? We're always burning stuff. Whether we're burning trash out in your yard, we're burning gasoline in our cars, we're burning coal at a factory. Every time we burn, what are we giving off? Heat. And carbon dioxide. So over the last few years, what has happened to the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? It's increased. And it continues to increase. And some scientists blame that for what? Global warming. They said that the CO2 helps to hold in what?
It's all a lie. I don't know.
What do scientists think the CO2 holds in to the atmosphere? Heat. I think it's sort of like a transparent blanket over the sky. that light can come through it. So light energy from the sun is still coming in, same amount. But that usually when light hits something, what happens to that light?
It was reflect.
Well, it gets converted into what? Light energy gets converted into heat energy. And on a normal day, the amount of light coming in should be balanced out by what? The amount of heat going out. And if those two are always the same, what should happen to the temperature of the Earth? It should stay the same. But the idea with the global warming is that the greenhouse gases like CO2 and methane let the light come through, but they slow down the leaving of it, heat, so that every day the amount of light energy coming in is more than what? The amount of heat energy going out. And if you buy that, the only logical conclusion is what's going to happen. The Earth's going to heat up. There's a lot of debate about that, but here's the other situation though. So we've increased the amount of CO2 by combustion, and there's some people worried about what's going on in the oceans, because the oceans just absorb CO2, and they turn it into bicarbonate. You guys who know anything about chemistry, what's bicarbonate? What kind of chemical is it? It's a base. Bicarbonate's a base. So by CO2 dissolving in water, if enough of it dissolves, what's going to happen to the oceans? They're going to become basic. And that means the pH is going to go which way? Up. And if it goes up enough, what do we know is going to happen? Everything's going to die. And it turns out that most photosynthesis on Earth actually happens where? In the ocean. It's where most of our oxygen comes from. Ultimately, it's where most food comes from. That's the part of this CO2 thing I think we need to be worrying about more than the temperature. Is what's going on in the oceans, and see if it's really changing the pH of the oceans, because that would be bad. There's also photosynthesis going on in the oceans. They're taking in CO2, releasing oxygen, that same kind of thing. But the main process is to think about with the carbon cycle. Photosynthesis, taking CO2 out of the air, using it to make organic compounds like sugar. Cell respiration, taking those organic compounds, burning them, combusting them, giving off CO2, making ATP, cycling the carbon over and over and over and over and over. And remember that we as humans have affected this cycle by burning things. We've also affected it by cutting down a whole lot of trees, right? By cutting down forests, by clearing off land and putting concrete there instead. And that also has increased the amount of CO2, right? Because plants normally would lower CO2. If there's less plants, there's going to be more wet, more CO2. All right, so that is where we will stop for the day.